The fairy tale wasn't just fake. It was engineered, monetized, and locked down like a corporate takeover before the world even realized what was happening. Because 2 days before the public heard the name of Harry and Meghan's daughter, the digital empire around her identity was already claimed, secured, and weaponized. And according to Tom Bower, that wasn't coincidence. That was control. That was strategy. That was the moment the illusion cracked and the real power dynamic revealed itself.
Deal with Rupert Murdoch's News UK, specifically the Times newspaper, but I believe it may also
lose everything. And I'm a betting man. I'm pretty sure that's what William will do. And it's the only way his income.
I was told this week that Charles is incredibly hurt by what's happened with Harry and Meghan.
He may well be hurt.
Tom Bower spent 2 years digging into Harry and Meghan's world, talked to 80 people, many who wouldn't speak publicly, and uncovered secrets he couldn't share before. But here's what'll blow your mind. 2 days before the world knew their baby's name, someone had already registered the website and locked it down for business. That single move, it showed exactly who's really running the show. And in March, Bower's dropping Revenge 2 with all the stories he couldn't reveal the first time. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear isn't the fairy tale they sold you. Before we reveal everything, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what's coming is wild. And if you're already hooked, smash that like button. Trust me, you won't believe what we're about to uncover.
Hospital, the birth, that was completely fabricated. We all know. The first interview was because, remember.
And that's when everything stopped being a love story and started looking like a corporate acquisition disguised as romance. Because royal families don't operate like Silicon Valley startups. They don't quietly secure trademarks and digital assets before even telling their own blood relatives the baby's name. But this time, someone did. And the speed of that move revealed a mindset that wasn't thinking about tradition, it was thinking about ownership, positioning, monetization. And suddenly, the question wasn't just what happened. The question was who was really running the machine behind the curtain. Let's dive in. Someone registered leahbet.com to full days before the world knew the baby's name. Let that sink in for a second. Harry's closest relatives hadn't even heard what the baby was being called yet. But that website already locked down and ready for business. Not after the announcement, not during the phone call, before anyone outside their house knew a thing. Pause and absorb that. Because that single act didn't just secure a domain, it exposed the blueprint.
Get the truth from Meghan Markle or Prince Harry. They are pathological liars. They cherry-pick.
Harry was raised in a world where names weren't business opportunities. They were emotional legacies, protected, sacred, untouchable. But this was different. This wasn't about emotional meaning. This was about control of the narrative before anyone else could even breathe it. And when Harry made that call announcing the name, it wasn't a conversation. It was a declaration. No consultation. No seeking approval. Just an announcement that carried the weight of something already decided, already executed, already monetized. And when the BZZ reported there hadn't been formal permission to use the intimate nickname, the silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was deafening. Now, think about this for a moment. If you genuinely had permission, if everyone was on board and happy about it, you just get someone to confirm it and the whole thing's done, right? One simple confirmation and the controversy dies immediately. Instead, what happens? Pushback.
Powerful and meaningful depiction of American tradition. She really played it up, trying to sell.
Denial and complete silence from everyone who could actually clear it up. The BBC didn't back down on their story. They stood firm, didn't retract anything. And Harry's team, they never showed anything confirming that permission was actually given. Nobody ever came forward to say yes, this was all approved beforehand. The silence told the whole story. And that silence wasn't random, it was revealing. Because silence is often louder than denial. Silence suggests there are truths too inconvenient to clarify. And suddenly, insiders began connecting dots that painted a picture far more calculated than the public fairy tale. Because Harry didn't grow up thinking about domains and branding. That wasn't his world. But someone else had spent decades perfecting that game. For 30 years, he lived in an environment where you don't think about domain names.
And the next, brazenly courting publicity. The peeved prince's deep desire.
You don't think about business opportunities. You definitely don't think about locking down websites before making family announcements. It's just not how his brain works. But Meghan, completely different story. She'd been creating her personal brand since her teenage years, blogging, networking, building a carefully crafted image. Her mindset centers on assets and opportunities. And suddenly, the contrast couldn't be clearer. One was raised to preserve legacy, the other was trained to build one from scratch, no matter what it required. And when those two worlds collided, tradition didn't win, strategy did. Because when someone sees opportunity, they don't wait. They secure it. They own it. They control it. It's a business asset with serious value attached to it. And the timing. The domain got secured before any family conversation even happened. Lock down the business side first. Handle the courtesy calls after.
Oral posturing. All of it possibly delivered without actually sitting through the film itself. And then came the numbers. 100.
Someone from Harry's world would never operate like this. But it's exactly how someone thinking strategically about brand building and market positioning would move. That's when Tom Bower realized he wasn't looking at emotional decisions. He was looking at a system, a pattern, a formula repeated again and again. A formula where public image and private reality weren't just different, they were engineered to be opposites. Because behind every emotional tribute, there was positioning. Behind every symbolic gesture, there was leverage. And when you look at it that way, it becomes pretty clear who's driving that decision. This is what Tom Bower means when he talks about the gap between the public image and what actually happened. The sweet story about honoring a family nickname surface level. Underneath, you've got domain registrations, business planning, and commercial strategy happening before the family's even in the loop. But that was only the beginning, because as Bower dug deeper, interviewing dozens of insiders, a far darker portrait began to emerge. Stories that didn't just challenge the public narrative, they obliterated it. Sources who spoke cautiously, fearfully, because they knew what happened to people who stopped being useful. They vanished. Disappeared from the narrative like they never existed. There were things he found that stayed in his research files. So what was he hearing about? There's talk about exclusive social circles and high-end networking back in her 20s. The kind of world where connections matter more than anything else, where who you know determines what doors open for you. And Meghan was moving through that world in a very specific way. This wasn't accidental success. It was strategic ascension. Every connection served a purpose. Every relationship had value. And when that value expired, so did the relationship. Her father, her first husband, old friends. One by one, they became ghosts in the new narrative. Because evolution requires shedding the past. And reinvention requires erasure. And Harry became the ultimate reinvention opportunity. A prince isolated from his old world, cut off from lifelong friendships, detached from family traditions, slowly reshaped into something new, something dependent, something controlled. And then came the Oprah interview, the moment that reshaped global perception overnight. 50 million people watching, 50 million people believing, 50 million people emotionally invested in a story that Tom Bower claims contained cracks. 17 of them. 17 claims that didn't align with verifiable reality. 17 fractures hidden beneath emotional delivery and carefully crafted vulnerability. But the most disturbing part wasn't the inconsistencies. It was the effectiveness. Because perception doesn't require truth, it requires belief. And belief had already been secured. By the time the world began asking questions, the narrative was already locked in place. Just like that domain, just like that identity, just like that empire. And Tom Bower knew something even bigger was coming. Secrets that hadn't made it into the first book. Stories too explosive to publish at the time. Revelations waiting in the shadows, ready to detonate. Because the fairy tale wasn't just ending, it was being exposed. The most chilling realization wasn't that the fairy tale had cracks. It was that the cracks had been there from the beginning, hidden behind perfect smiles, staged vulnerability, and a narrative so carefully crafted it convinced millions they were watching a love story when they were actually watching a takeover. Because while the world believed Harry had escaped captivity, insiders began whispering something far darker, that he hadn't escaped anything at all. He had simply traded one system for another. One where loyalty wasn't inherited, it was enforced. Behind the gates of Montecito, far from the royal palaces and the lifelong friendships that once defined him, Harry's world had shrunk. The laughter of childhood friends had been replaced by silence. The familiar voices that grounded him were gone, and those who remained weren't remnants of his past, they were constructs of a new reality. Because Tom Bower's investigation revealed something deeply unsettling. Isolation wasn't a side effect, it was part of the process. One by one, the relationships that shaped Harry's identity disappeared. Friends who once shared inside jokes and battlefield brotherhood suddenly became strangers. They weren't phased out gradually, they were eliminated completely. Invitations stopped, phone calls stopped, access stopped, and the most devastating part was in the distance. It was how fast it happened. Lifelong bonds severed like they never existed, as if someone had rewritten his entire emotional blueprint and replaced it with dependency. This wasn't about disagreements or natural drifting apart. This was systematic detachment, the kind that leaves someone standing alone, surrounded only by those approved to remain. Because when someone loses every connection to their past, they lose perspective, they lose grounding, they lose resistance. And that's when control becomes effortless. Meanwhile, Tom Bower's sources described a pattern that stretched back years before Harry ever entered the picture. A pattern where people weren't companions, they were stepping stones. Where relationships weren't permanent, they were transitional. And when those stepping stones stopped leading upward, they were abandoned without hesitation. Her father, once a central pillar in her life, suddenly became an outsider when he stopped serving the narrative. Her first husband, erased with surgical precision when his presence no longer aligned with her trajectory. Old friends, discarded once their existence conflicted with a new image being constructed. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. It wasn't emotional reaction, it was strategic evolution. And then came Hollywood, the ultimate proving ground. The place where image is currency and reputation is survival. And initially, doors opened, invitations poured in, cameras flashed, deals were signed. But beneath the glamorous surface, something was already shifting. Industry insiders began noticing behavior that didn't align with collaboration, it aligned with domination. Requests weren't suggestions, they were demands. Roles weren't accepted, they were redefined. One of the most powerful figures in fashion, Edward Enninful, extended a prestigious opportunity, a moment that could have solidified alliances. But instead of collaboration, there was control. Instead of partnership, there was interference. And when boundaries were enforced, the relationship fractured beyond repair. Because control isn't negotiable. Control doesn't compromise. Journalist Sam Kashner's experience left scars so deep he summarized it with 4 devastating words: manipulated, betrayed, played, orchestrated. Words that didn't just describe professional tension, they described psychological warfare. Words chosen carefully by someone who understood the weight of their meaning. And slowly, Hollywood began responding, not with confrontation, but with distance. Invitations became less frequent. Calls went unanswered. Opportunities quietly disappeared. Because in Hollywood, reputation spreads faster than headlines. And once someone becomes associated with unpredictability, the risk outweighs the reward. At the same time, the financial empire everyone expected to explode began collapsing under its own weight. The Netflix deal that was supposed to guarantee endless success started losing momentum. The Spotify partnership dissolved amid reports of disappointment. Projects stalled, revenue slowed, and suddenly, the carefully constructed future looked far less stable than promised. Because branding alone doesn't sustain power. Perception alone doesn't generate loyalty. And when controversy becomes the primary commodity, eventually even controversy loses value. But desperation breeds escalation. And that's when Tom Bower's revelations became even more explosive. Because according to his research, the strategy was evolving. When opportunities dry up, the narrative intensifies. When relevance fades, revelations emerge. More secrets, more accusations, more emotional storytelling designed to reignite public attention. Because attention is currency, and losing attention means losing control, and insiders began noticing the signs. The sudden reappearances at events previously deemed unworthy, the carefully staged public moments designed to spark speculation. The strategic interviews that reopened old wounds just as the spotlight began dimming. Nothing random, nothing accidental. Every move calibrated to restore relevance. But perhaps the most devastating realization wasn't financial or professional. It was psychological. Because Tom Bower's investigation didn't just expose decisions, it exposed a mindset. A mindset where identity itself becomes fluid, where narratives aren't lived, they're constructed, where reality becomes secondary to perception. And Harry remained at the center of it all. A prince who once commanded global admiration, now reduced to a controversial figure fighting to maintain relevance. His legacy entangled in a narrative he didn't fully control. His past erased, his present scrutinized, his future uncertain. Meanwhile, Tom Bower prepared to release the next chapter, the secrets too dangerous to publish before. The story's sources whispered but feared attaching their names to. The truth that could dismantle everything the public believed. Because the first book wasn't the explosion, it was the warning. And now, as Revenge 2 looms on the horizon, the question isn't whether more bombshells will emerge. The question is whether the empire built on perception can survive exposure. Because once the illusion breaks, it never fully recovers. And somewhere behind the palace walls, behind the Montecito gates, behind the carefully curated public appearances, the real story continues unfolding. Not the fairy tale sold to the world, not the emotional narrative broadcast to millions, but the calculated reality Tom Bower spent years uncovering. A reality where love and strategy became indistinguishable. A reality where power wasn't inherited, it was taken.